I started corresponding with Friedrich Hayek shortly after I read the first book of his that I read was called Denationalisation of Money. So I started writing letters to him asking questions about the practicalities of denationalising money. I thought this is a great step forward. And he was very patient. He answered every letter. And we developed a fairly good relationship by mail. Then a few years after that, my friend and colleague Ron Kitching rang me from Queensland shortly after Milton Friedman had visited Australia, and he said, hey, Milton Friedman went well, I think Australia's ready for Hayek. And I said, great idea, you ring him. And Kitching did, and said, Ron, he rang me back, he said, Ron, you'll have to put some money in the pot to get him here. Then he rang back a little bit later, so you have to put a little bit more money in because Hayek would like to bring his wife. So we did that, and Hayek's visit went particularly well, and it was the whole transcript of his Australian lecture series was published by CIS, which is a magnificent volume. Then from there on, I enjoyed a little one-on-one huddle in the corner with Hayek at every Mont Pelerin Society meeting. And I think in Berlin in 1982, I said to Hayek, I said, just a bit slow down, I'm not an economist. And he put his head back and he said, that's wonderful. And he said in his Austrian accent, we economists, we dream our dreams, we dream our schemes, but we don't do anything. He said, you, as a businessman, you fire the bullets. We can only make them, but you will fire the bullets. And I walked away from that meeting 10 foot tall. I felt that I'd been given a job to do. So I think that's probably when I got active and set up my Mancal Economic Education Foundation, which, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, but we celebrate our 15th anniversary this year. We've got a document called the 15th Anniversary Issue, and there's some copies down the back. And but of note in there, our young scholars put this together apart from my one-page chairman's address. The rest is them going through our old files and archives and deciding what I should be putting in the bin after all these years. But they came across a submission that I made to the post-secondary education inquiry that they had back in 1975. And it was my alarm. I showed alarm at the type of economics that were being taught in our universities at that time. It's 1975, long before most of you were born. But in their publication, it says, in the 70s, I became alarmed at the style of economics being taught to students. As a businessman, I felt that populist Keynesian economics was no way to run a business or a country. I was asked to submit some positive comments to a state government inquiry, and here's the original submission. After exactly 37 years, we have evidence in the form of a so-called global financial crisis, showing what economic illiteracy brings, and it brings with it a very high price. For the full 3-page submission, go to click, 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 and the submission talks about the works of Mises, and Rothbard, and Hayek. So I was alarmed even back then. I run a family company that's been going for 117 years. It was started by my grandfather as a mining consultancy business, and it still goes. I'm still running it 117 years later. Now, 117 years is a long time in Australia's history. It's 6 years before we had a bloody flag. And it's 6 years before we had a constitution. So that's how long our company's been going. And I wonder if the company would still survive and prosper if it were run under the regime of Keynesian economics. I don't know, but I doubt it. So that's my introduction comments, but I'd like to talk about something else. We've talked to other speakers, we'll talk about a global financial crisis and the financial side of things. I'd just like to talk about another crisis that worries me equally, and that's the crisis of leadership that we're confronted with. Am I unfair to suggest that we have a crisis of leadership?
No.
I think both internationally and here in Australia, this is of concern. My background, as I mentioned, is in resources, so I probably think a little bit from the resource area. But if I'm talking about resources, I'm talking about every productive, creative enterprise in Australia in that sense. Political leadership, I think, is everywhere in crisis because our elected leaders have simply forgotten the importance of earning our respect. My friend Frank Furedi, who our Mankell Foundation hosted in Perth over about a year ago, in a paper that he's produced for the Centre for Independent Studies, the paper's titled Leadership, Liberty and the Crisis of Authority. And I'll quote from Frank's papers. He says, ideas about leadership have become so confused and so troublesome, especially in the United States and Europe. I first became interested in the question of leadership when I was asked to attend a NATO conference in Brussels a year after the 9/11 attacks. One of the aims of the conference was to figure out possible responses to devastating terrorist attacks like the 9/11 on European cities. If a major terrorist attack occurred in Paris, London or Brussels, whom would we trust to go on television and tell the public what happened? Who would we trust to guide the people? Who would we trust to make the hard decisions? The Italians soon pointed out, well, Berlusconi isn't going to do it. If there was a catastrophic event in Rome, we don't want Berlusconi anywhere near a television studio. And then the Belgians got up and said, look, in Belgium, we haven't got a government. We haven't got a prime minister. They spent a long time, about a day and a half, thinking about it and decided they would probably look to their king, who, although was not a very charismatic character, was still a symbol of unity and could be trusted to respond adequately. When it came to us, the British, to choose who we would trust in dire circumstances, it became quickly evident that regardless of our political affiliations, Tony Blair wasn't the man for the job. By then, Blair had lost a lot of credibility and was generally regarded as a puppet of spin doctors. Although he was still a serious statesman and an individual, Blair wasn't the kind of person you wanted to rely on in a wartime disaster-related situation. So after a prolonged discussion, having looked at every possibility, we came up with the name of Trevor McDonald, a Caribbean newscaster who was reasonably trustworthy, mellow of speech, and reliable in the fact that he was there every night. Basically, someone would believe. It may sound strange, but if London was quarantined and people had to follow certain instructions to leave the city, we would prefer Trevor McDonald to our elected leaders telling us what to do. Every single delegation more or less came up with bizarre ideas and actually confirmed our suspicions that neither the experts nor the public had any real confidence in the people with formal claim to leadership, who were in office and who held the official titles of Prime Ministers, Presidents, Ministers and the rest. Well, I think our Australian corporate leaders, this is me speaking, not Frank, our Australian corporate leaders are also in crisis, both because many of them haven't got the respect that they should have, and the other thing is they've forgotten the importance of making a profit. I wouldn't enjoy being a retired person living off the dividends paid by, for instance, the Australian mining companies, or living off the dividends of BHP, Rio Tinto or Newcrest. Better to buy the grocery shops. If you'd like to form your opinions on the state and quality of leadership in our resource industry, just read the chairman's addresses and CEO's reports in their annual reports. Their writing does not express the excitement of the creative process that really should permeate our exploration and our manufacturing industries. Exciting, creating things should spark excitement. I think their writing is more apologetic and looks like the work of junior PR flacks who are instructed to insert into every paragraph the much overworked weasel words of sustainability, corporate responsibility, social licence to operate. These are words that were attacked by Hayek years ago when he gave a talk on weasel words, and he analysed these things. He likened them to social justice. Really meaningless terms. Don't get me started on the origin of these things. So I ask instead, where are our leaders? You can count a few. You can probably count about 4 corporate leaders if you think hard enough. But what about the other 2,000? Where is their ability to explain what industry does? It wasn't always like this. There was a time when you could get to know the nature of people running a company by reading the chairman's addresses and the corporate annual reports. But now I don't think they actually are allowed to write their own reports, these publications. They're run by little cub junior PR flakes to make it sound right, but they say nothing. I've looked at these things. I'm so concerned I'm running an essay contest with Curtin University so they can analyse these reports and write a report saying leadership or the lack thereof. And that they will independently analyse these chairmen's addresses for what they really say, about their company. There was a time, and the first book I've written 4 books. The first one was called So I Headed West, but it was about my grandfather's time, covered Ballarat, Broken Hill and the early mining era. And one chapter in that is called When Miners Were Heroes. And that was the time when miners were heroes. They went out somewhere in the outback, made a discovery, built cities, created communities, and were respected. And you wouldn't get a politician messing with them because they were tough nuts and they knew exactly what they meant. They had an understanding of philosophy, and most of those companies employed a backroom philosopher to write the history of the companies and what was happening at the time, because it was so exciting. No longer do these companies have backroom philosophers to give guidance to the people running the company, who are like politicians, and they get so busy with the day-to-day affairs they can't really think about the deeper issues. Instead, they have PR flacks whose main challenge is to match wits with the government equivalent PR flacks. So they little score points off each other, but there's no depth, there's no philosophy, understanding of what the creative enterprise can do for the country. There was once a proud Australian mining company called the Western Mining Corporation, whose PR people felt so embarrassed by having the name mining in the company title that they talked the board into expunging the name mining from the company, and it became WMC Resources, more politically correct. But they were apologising for something they should have been proud of. Just a brief comment on political leadership. As we've seen the US election recently, which bears many similarities to our Australian political scene, where unfortunately there are more people voting for a living than actually working for a living. Vast hordes of voters seem to be fixated on the fable of being led, comforted and safely delivered by a politician. Strange, even as presidential and prime minister popularity and effectiveness erode, at the same time we see their powers continue to expand as they clamp down on our freedom of speech and gain access to every telephone call and every email we send. Unheard of, the concept of them eavesdropping would have been unheard of 10 or 20 years ago, but now we take it for given. No sign of any revolt, I'm afraid. I've just about given up all hope on my generation, but I'm more optimistic about the younger generation who've got the ability to vigorously question some of the material put out, all of the material put out by their political masters. Here's an example. For the US, just in the weeks leading up to the US presidential election, their unemployment figures were released. Higher unemployment figures. But the president said, these figures were good news. These were his words. These figures are good news. It goes to show that there are more people looking for a job. Now, that's the actual definition of unemployment. And somebody should tell him the higher the number, the worse it gets. It's not good news at all. But over here in the West on the same week, we just completed a structure called it's a basketball arena, and it came in nearly 400 times over budget. Now our Premier said, don't worry about that, but this building will be an icon, much the same as the Sydney Opera House is to Sydney. So don't worry about the 400% over budget. Similarly, they've just passed legislation to establish a state future fund on borrowed money. Now, nobody seems to question whether it makes sense to borrow money to start a future fund. Well, I hope our young people do. There's no directly responsible individual, or DRI as they call it in the corporate world, in politics. It's never anyone's fault. Nobody ever loses their job. Anyway, let's put politics aside and focus on corporate leadership. And as I mentioned, my field has been in resources, but the comments apply equally to all. Where have we lost the plot, and what are we going to do about it? How did we slip backwards from this era when 100 years ago miners were heroes to today's situation where our governments and electors generally see industry as an ATM? They just see any productive industry as an ATM that they walk in and press a button and out pops the money for their entitlements. A poisonous word, entitlements. Well, in the early respected era, as I said, they had scribes doing the hard work behind the thing. And why do companies need philosophy? It's a question that Ayn Rand asked in her book, Why do businessmen need philosophy? So I'll leave it to you to find that book by Ayn Rand, and she goes into great detail. And the comments were written some years ago, of course, but equally applicable today. We do need philosophy. We shouldn't shrug at the word and say, I'm in business, who needs philosophy? We need it more than anybody else because there are enemies of industry lined up against us. If we don't understand the enemy, we will not come out of the other end of the tunnel. We'll be pummeled to death on the way through. By understanding philosophy, we would be able to have people working within these companies who understand the nature of this attack being inflicted on our industry. I think some of our corporate people are unable to distinguish things like envy, distinguish envy from jealousy, for instance, or covetousness. Without such understanding, it's impossible to confront and continue in this battle. Envy is unlike jealousy or covetousness, in that whilst jealousy is the desire to protect what's yours and covetousness is the desire to take what somebody else has, envy is the desire to destroy what somebody else possesses. Think the dark green activist. It involves no rational self-interest, only the will to harm others. Envy is a vice, and the nature of vices is that it's insatiable. You cannot satiate envy with politics or policies of partial distribution. You're doomed to fail because envy by its nature cannot be satisfied. Half measures will only inflame the appetite for wealth destruction. Our industry has lost respect of the thinkers that we desperately need. Our trader-denominated society overlooks the importance of the history of getting things right. And by frustrating the writing class, the productive sector has almost drawn upon themselves wrath and scorn, and we're now paying the price. I first identified this as a serious problem when, with a group of industry supporters around about 2002, I think it was, we set out to raise $25 million to build the Australian Mining Hall of Fame as part of the bicentenary celebrations that year. And apart from Professor Geoffrey Blaney's great books documenting the heroes of bygone days, we could find no narrative that really effectively described the culture of creativity coming out of exploration and mining. So we had to write it ourselves, and we wrote that narrative ourselves, and we used that to raise the funds. And then when we handed over the project to the mining industry itself and to the people of Kalgoorlie, that narrative stopped. The people running it from there on didn't realise the importance of continuing the narrative, so the project floundered. So we'll have this problem until we discover the ability to write the stories of our industry and our creative enterprises and get them out into the media, get them understood, get them out to the schools so people will look at business and the creation and industry as a noble occupation. Now, it's getting toward the conclusion, folks, so we can wind down a bit. But I've got 2 reasons for optimism. Let me end on an optimistic note. First, my involvement with the younger generation gives me great cause for optimism. And as I mentioned, I've almost given up on my own generation and it's our specialty of passing on debt to future generations. The next generation are very aware that each of them are inheriting $85,000 worth of personal debt, and that's got nothing to do with their HECS or their university education. It's $85,000 being left to each man, woman and child by the previous generation. So I set up this Mancal Economic Education with a view of sharing some of these ideas on the principles of the free market and how it can benefit the lives of all Australians with the next generation of leaders. We started modestly, sending 4 people in the first year to conferences, seminars and internships internationally and within Australia. And I had no idea that after 15 years we would have sent over 600 young people to these events. And today we've sponsored 5 of West Australia's future leaders right here today. What about just stand up so we can cite them out? We can identify them, fellas. Come on. I hope you've been. Here we are. Look, what a team.
Yeah. Also, last year they were a big supporter and sponsor as well, and sponsor in many other ways and with advertising and. Big supporter, so thank you.
Thanks for the commercial. Now, I think these guys are here to meet you and spend time with you, not with me. And I want them to spend as much time with Chris Brown as possible because I want a little of Chris's ideas of rebellion to rub off on these people. Come back, but I'll catch up with them at breakfast at 7:30 tomorrow morning, fellas. We'll meet up at my hotel around the corner. And then you can be all back here for 9 o'clock for the early start. The bonus for me is that by maintaining contact with these wonderful young people is that I benefit. I learn far more from them than they could ever learn from me. So that's a bit of good news for me. They've plugged me into social media. I've now got 5,200 Facebook friends. With one of our former Mancal scholars who's now graduated, now living in New York. He's my Facebook manager. For 2 or 3 hours a day, he works my Facebook and he answers a lot of difficult economic questions and finds some exquisite stuff to put up on there. My Facebook site's been voted the best economic and policy Facebook site in Australia, so it's a tribute to him. I've also got over 3,000 LinkedIn contacts. Nobody's shown me what to do with LinkedIn yet, so that's the next step. Now, several years ago, through all these activities, I was appointed to the Board of Overseers from the Atlas Economic Research Institute in Washington, D.C. And that's opened up my eyes to the seething world of free market think tanks over there. And Atlas have created and nurtured over 395 think tanks in so many countries in the world, so many countries that you probably haven't even heard about, but they activate these things. Atlas runs the Academy for think tank scholars to generate think tank scholars, and they run the MBA course for think tanks. So the people come out qualified with all the aspects of running a think tank, raising funds, using it wisely, the correct stewardship of other people's money, all these basic principles that are essential if a think tank is going to live and survive. And this is a real education for me. And we've got 10 of our young people working for us part-time, as much the same way as Luke has done it. They're the people that put together our monthly publications and our e-Focus monthly newsletter, which you can subscribe to. You go up to the mancal.org website and plug in. The second cause for optimism, as I conclude, the second cause is that the tremendous opportunities created by the financial illiteracy of our elected leaders, as they have managed to drive down the intrinsic, or the value of so many of our assets in Australia below their intrinsic worth, it's created wonderful opportunities for your generation to hop in and make a feast, take some long-term positions in some stuff that's been driven down just through bad political management. The famous investor, Sir John Templeton, until he died recently, was a great supporter of all the whole think tank movement. He said, "One principle that I've used throughout my career is to invest at the point of maximum pessimism. That is the time to be most optimistic. It's the point of very optimum pessimism. Bull markets," he said, "are born on pessimism, grow on scepticism, mature on optimism, and die on euphoria. The time of maximum pessimism is the best time to buy, and the time of maximum optimism is the best time to sell." So just as we make our own decisions in such matters, so too the government really should decide. They've got some decisions ahead of them. The government must decide whether it prefers an expanding industry base in Australia, creating jobs, earning revenue, supporting a healthy service industry, all contributing to the real welfare of Australia, or do they want to continue crippling industries in much the same way as already been done to our manufacturing and farming industries? In deciding to create new taxes and lengthening the approvals process for about anything anyone tries to do in Australia, they've managed to reduce the rewards for something. And you know if you do that, you get less of it. And if you increase the reward, you get more of it. In Australia today, government is intent on taxing work, savings, investment, thrift, productivity, effort, success and risk, but they subsidise non-work, unemployment, debt, borrowing, leisure, idleness and mediocrity, and we are getting much more of the latter than we were of the former. Whilst our productive enterprises enjoy cycling upturns from time to time, the politicians should forego their greed and allow industries to expand and produce, carrying the countries forward until we get other industries and startups that will continue on the good work. Many of us within the resource industries were mystified why Canberra decided to tamper with one of Australia's few remaining success stories, but it reminds me of one of my poems that's going in my next book, which will be a book of poems that will be called The Poetic Soul of a Prospector. This poem is dedicated to those lovely fellows of the tax department. Their souls wish us to be unhappy. It aggravates them to have us vigorous, efficient and free. They would much rather have the feeling that fate is disciplining you and me. It gives their egos wings when yours and mine are clipped. They like to see our skeletons when all the meat's been stripped. We whose lives could be ruined in an hour, listening to their puerile point of view, can still aggravate these little souls by remaining vigorous, free and efficient. So now, dear friends, that's exactly what I do. Just about there. Our elected leaders in some way have quite a few of the corporate leaders. They've failed, as I said before, to earn our respect. And it's easy for us to measure the character of our current crop of leaders. What is the measure? How do we measure them? Well, any idiot can vandalise or destroy property or art or a book, an enterprise or even a nation's economy. That's easy. The sheer genius and satisfaction is in achievement, in creating buildings, creating art, competitive sport, creating books, enterprises and productive enterprises. This creative skill is a measure of a person's character. It's also important to understand the character of the people with whom we choose to work. It's also important to understand the difference between simply a job and a vocation. It's equally important for employers to understand whether they are simply passing on a job or passing on a vocation. It's easy to hand somebody a job. Done. Easy. A little bit of paper saying job description, on you go. But how do you pass on a vocation? It requires thought and skill. It takes time and patience to pass on all those little markers and guidelines that you've written down as a guide to your own career. When it comes the time to pass these things on, how do we pass on all these little things to people? I'll give you 3 examples of these little one-liner wisdom pieces. Aristotle Onassis, the much married and extremely successful shipping magnate, had a notation in his little red notebook that said, never begin a battle, a deal or a love affair if the fear of losing overshadows the prospect of winning. Another by David Frank, a mind is like a parachute, it only works when it's open. If this sounds too serious, then try Woody Allen's one-liner. The difference between sex and death is that you can do it alone with death and no one is going to make fun of you. However, seriously, I bet every successful person in this room has got a little collection of these one-liners. Think about how you're going to pass this on to the next generation. Otherwise, it'll be gone. Conclusion. So in a sense, whether we end up working for a small company or a large company, I hope that we're all gravitating toward the productive sector. Much more self-esteem to be found there. Whatever we end up doing, in a sense, we'll still be working for ourselves. We have total control over our levels of productivity, our levels of creativity and our honesty primarily to ourselves. So let's hold ourselves responsible for a higher standard than anyone else would expect of us. My message, never let yourself down. What will we leave behind? What will be our legacy? Well, way back in 442 BC, Pericles managed to put very concisely what I've been trying to say today. He said this: what you leave behind is not what is engraved in stone or in stone monuments, but what it is that is woven into the lives of others. Thank you.